thinking about potentially moving to Hillside in the future, we hope.
Mhm.
And just wanted to host Steve today. It seemed very appropriate for the time of year. And just, give a little bit of a look at some of the things that our residents get to participate in and be a part of when they live here at Hillside, including, informative lectures and presentations. And so if you have questions for me about Hillside Village, I think most of you probably know how to contact us already, so we would love to hear from you. We're doing virtual tours right now. We're also doing in-person tours right now. So if that's something that you think you might like to do, we would love to see you here. And I'm not going to delay any longer, and I'm just going to turn it right over to Steve. So.
Great. Thanks, Tracy. Thanks, Kim, for having me here today. Yeah, always happy to talk about maple sugaring in New Hampshire anytime, but of course in March is always the best time to talk about that. Today I really just wanted to talk about the kind of the history and where we have been since European settlement to present day. To talk about kind of look at the past of sugaring, the history of it, what goes into it, and what things have changed over time, and in some cases what has stayed the same, and just bring up the speed of where we are today. And so with that, I will share my screen. And you can stop seeing my face, and we'll look at some nice photos. So if you have questions, feel free to either put them in the chat or just unmute, or just say call out whatever it is. It's a pretty small group, so I think we could do that. So history of maple sugaring in New England, to give you a sense. In New Hampshire, there's about 500 to 600 sugar makers in the state, and probably about 40% of the syrup that's produced in New Hampshire is produced by the top 5% producers. So they're really big producers. And so locally, we have folks like Bascom's Maple. That's a massive setup, and they're producing thousands and thousands of gallons of syrup on an annual basis during the season. And then the vast majority are people who have operations at maybe 300 to 500 taps, and those are just either hobbyists or small farms, people diversifying what they're doing out there. And that's more common in the Keene area and in Cheshire County, but also across the whole state that we see here. But every once in a while you come across someone who may have 2,000 taps, 5,000 taps, 10,000 taps. But really the norm for New Hampshire is that 300 to 500. And the same thing to the west too in Vermont, pretty similar. But as you go further up into Vermont, you tend to have these large installations of taps and sugar bushes there. Oops, here we go. There we go. So when we think of sugaring, this is kind of the old kind of pastoral scene that we think of, with the ox team pulling a barrel in the old sugar house with wood to burn, sap yoke, what we have here, go across the shoulders to carry those buckets around. That's pretty much what you see on the side of maple jugs as well. But we'll get into what it really looks like today. But that's the historic kind of part that we think of sugaring, and that has been happening throughout the northeastern and central part of North America for centuries now, and even longer with native populations. But anywhere you have sugar maple, you can produce maple syrup. And so that reaches down into Georgia, goes well into Ontario, into Minnesota. And we're up here in New Hampshire in the maple, in the heart of maple region. But people think Vermont is the big producer, but Ohio and West Virginia used to be some of the largest producers of maple syrup in the 1800s. And they've moved on to other things. Historically, in the 1800s, 1700s, 1800s, this is what a sugaring camp would look like. It would be folks would leave the farm and go into the woods in some cases, and actually collect sap and boil it down in these large vats here, where you have these large cast iron pots over an open fire, and they would boil and boil and boil until they actually produce sugar, and that's syrup. At that time, sugar was much more stable, and they didn't really have a good method for packing syrup at that point. So they'd be producing maple sugar, and that's why we call it maple sugaring. Moving up, we've had this have folks leaving the farms, going to cities, and farming it becoming more of a novelty, and people would actually come into these old sugar houses for open houses and things like that, to try sugar on snow, to have a donut with their maple syrup. You can see there's a plate of pickles there too to cleanse the palate. But if you're familiar with sugar on snow, that's what this is. You pour hot syrup on some nice clean snow, and it produces almost like a taffy, and it's actually a great treat for everyone. And we've seen these kind of these funny things popping up too, as more and more folks move to the city. They still wanted the maple syrup, and so this, I think, is just a horrible thing to see the Boston or the Bay State Maple Syrup Company in Boston, Massachusetts, having our Mount Washington maple syrup brand there too. So it seems like it's just not right. But that was the whole idea of marketing syrup at that time, marketing to the masses in the cities, and bringing bringing that farm life back into the cities for folks. And the reason for that is this. This is a historical graph that's put together data for both Canada and the United States. And you can see that in the 1800s, there was a large volume of maple syrup or maple sugar being produced. And that's because most folks were living on farms, and maple sugar was really the easiest way to bring in sugar and the cheapest way to bring in sugar into the house. And so the squares here represent the United States, the dots are Canada. Obviously, Canada had less population back then, it still does. But with World War II, people leaving the farm, going to work in factories, industrialization, people moving to the suburbs, people gave up sugaring as well. So we had this lull that happened from really the 40s, maybe even before that, the Great Depression, all the way to the 80s, where maple sugaring was kind of ignored. Very little innovation was happening until now. In recent years, there's been a spike. Canada has dominated maple syrup production on an annual basis, but you can see here there's that steep line here that we have in North America, and that really is continuing today with double-digit growth in the maple syrup industry. We skip over that. We see these large sugar maples still out there in the woods that were once tapped by the old timers long ago. And you can see that the tap holes are just buried in the wood. The tree continues to grow, and so you could go up to a really massive sugar maple with no evidence of tapping and cut into it, and you may find something like this, where once upon a time someone was tapping that tree, maybe in the 40s, the 50s, and then abandoned it, and it's just continued to grow as a tree. We find it in sawmills as well, boards being pulled off the sawmill line where there's old tap holes. You can see there's a tap. This is the tap hole here, and then the wood grew over it. So this is the older part of the tree, and this is the newer part. Older part here, and the newer part growing in, just nice clean wood. It just kind of hides that history that's in there. But the cool thing is that these trees, the wood, it stores that history for us to find if we cut the tree down or we do some dissection of it. So it's kind of neat. The other thing that we see out there in the landscape is just evidence of that past. This is in Sullivan, New Hampshire, just next to Keene. Here's an old stone arch that they would actually have the fire inside. The fire would be in between the two stones here. You can see this old rusted out pan, and that's what they would boil on right on top of there. That pan once laid across that, but abandoned in the woods in the middle of nowhere. No sugar maples to be found, probably because they were cut off, decades ago. Trees growing up in there too, but you can find these little evidence of sugar houses, maple evaporators scattered throughout the landscape here, because everyone was making maple syrup out there. And it wasn't, it was, and tapping has evolved for us. On a large scale, we'd have these battery-powered drills, and that the sugar maker would have to walk around with a battery strapped to their back, and that's what we see here with these wires, just a car battery going down to the drill and to do it. So if you're doing hundreds of taps, using a brace and bit really isn't going to cut it. And so this actually worked out pretty well. It's I'm not sure what was more laborious, hauling this giant battery around or actually using a hand drill to do it, but you can see this fellow seemed to like this setup. moving forward into the 70s and 60s, there's the gas-powered tapper. So it's almost like a little chainsaw with a drill bit coming out of it. I recently inherited one of these and got it running, and it is the worst thing to use in the world. It doesn't. It's so loud and it's scary to use. So, but it worked. You know, I guess it was easier than hauling a car battery around. And then you know, in modern day tapping, which is amazing, the cordless drill, it makes it so much easier to do, and it makes it so much faster as well. And so I don't know what I never experienced tapping on a large scale without a cordless drill. So I'm glad to have it. I appreciate it based on the other photos. Sap gathering, or just, you know, handling sap, has changed over time. There's a lovely photograph of the Bisons up in Berlin, New Hampshire, gathering sap with sap bags that they would use. You can see these plastic bags hanging on trees, but they're gathering their bigger bucket, and they bring it to a bigger barrel and keep on, gathering sap until they had it. Examples of the sap yoke. You know, can you imagine going through 2 feet of snow on snowshoes with a sap yoke and just spilling? It's quite a lot of labor to do that, a lot of work. You know, a sugar maker usually had a good team of oxen or a good draft horse to haul that sap. Sometimes these trailers would have wheels on them. Sometimes, you know, the sleighs. You never know what type of conditions you'd be experiencing. Example of that trailer that they would use, and that's actually Ken Bascom right here, up in Ackworth, and his son Bruce Bascom. If you know Bruce, that's little Bruce in the 60s there. And you know, just the amount of labor you had to do just to even cross that field with a horse. It's just, you know, it's just so much work back then. Still is. I love this setup. A little, probably Model A or Model T jitterbug, as they would call those things. Better than a horse, I think, but you know, pretty neat. And then the old bulldozer too. You know, just all these different ways of getting sap out of the woods. It just was whatever you had for equipment on the farm, whatever made most sense. Is kind of neat to see. Today we run into issues like this, and you know, hauling sap is this time of year is never good because the roads are really soft. But you know, usually we see trucks. You know, you can tell who's a sugar maker by what's in the back of their truck this time of year. There's always that white plastic tub or container that's there. And you know, this is also a pretty innovative approach too, using a good old-fashioned Mercedes-Benz Unimog to haul sap. But you know, I think it's a pretty modern version of a sap hauler there. Sugar houses, you know, essentially they've stayed the same. Once they moved from boiling sap over a fire and putting it on a pan, there's just a house with a cupola and an evaporator inside. And so, and you know, in this case, there's some wood. This is all wood storage here. But the whole goal was to bring sap into the sugar house. And this was early 1900s. You can see this family had a pretty advanced tubing setup using galvanized pipes to bring sap into the sugar house here. That same sugar house today, actually, or in later times after they abandoned the sugar camp. And here it is today. It's a pretty amazing that, you know, this sugar house was built in 1907, no longer in operation, but again, in the middle of nowhere. If you look up the slope here, there are no sugar maples except for the big one right here. In the 70s, those maples were cut off because no one was sugaring at that point. Peter Rhodes up in Alstead, if you know Peter, good friends of Bruce Bascom. His sugar house, perhaps one of the oldest ones in Cheshire County, and actually has beams that were taken off of the town gazebo in 1880, I believe it is, to build this sugar house. In the side of built into a side of a hill right next to a stream, which is on Peter's left side. But you know, very traditional sugar house. He may be third generation that's in there at this point, with his grandchildren helping him out today. Faulkner up on West Hill in Keene. He has to walk up to the sugar house during the mud season in the wintertime. During the dry times, he can drive up to it. But he remembers being a kid. He's probably in his 70s or 80s now, bringing glass jugs down with his father down to Route 9 once they're done making that syrup. Just a pretty neat location. So when you're at kind of the Target Plaza, you can look across the road on the hill. That's where he's located up there. Not too far from you at Hillside is I believe it's is it the old Borden Sugar House? I'm not sure, but it's next to the YMCA in Keene, this old sugar house, an old schoolhouse that was converted into a sugar house. I just love that it's in the city. It's made of brick. It has some graffiti on it that says sugar and syrup on it. So I think it's very appropriate. It's pretty neat to see out there. The point is that sugar, I just love sugar houses because they're all different. They're all diverse. They all kind of represent a story. And here's just the evolution of an old sugar house, probably, you know, in the 50s. And here going to maybe the 60s or 70s. They painted it this time into the 80s. And it's kind of just neat to see how these sugar houses evolve over time. Tapping has evolved quite a bit too. Historically, we use these wooden spiles or taps that may have been hollowed out, or even use sumac branches in historic, you know, way back when that were naturally hollow. Early 1900s, using galvanized pipe. You can see that pipe strung across trees with these funny gooseneck taps, all metal. You can imagine with wind and limbs falling off how easy it was to break those and how much of a hassle it must have been to maintain. We don't see those used today. And I don't think they were used very often in the past either. Tubing, the advent of, or the introduction of tubing coming into the system, into the sugaring system. Laying tubing on the ground, probably not the best practice, but that's how they originally did it. Coming into a collection point, and sometimes there'd be pouring buckets of sap into this and then flowing buckets of sap into this bucket and then flowing down to a sugar house or a bigger collection container. And then that kind of the really wholesale embrace of maple tubing, where we actually had tubing that had to be, and a lot of times they would actually take the tubing down every year. And so you would actually have to know which roll you're using, and you have to carry that roll of tubing back out to the line that you're setting up. But really, and that was the 70s, in late 60s into the 70s where tubing really took off. And then kind of that modern day tubing setup that we see now, where you may see on the side of the road a collection container or barrel with a bunch of tubing leading into it. And if you follow that tubing up into the woods, this is what you see. Just tubing that's pretty tight, strung up. The idea is that it's sealed, that there's no leakage or anything like that. You know, I equate sugaring to one big plumbing problem where you have to make sure there's no leakage or anything like that. And especially if you're dealing with a vacuum system, and then that becomes very important, because if your lines are under vacuum, you don't want any additional air coming into the system. So you need to monitor these lines quite a bit. And these lines are constantly being chewed on by squirrels, coyotes, foxes, black bears. Moose will run right through them. They don't care. They'll just rip them out. So there's a constant effort to maintain these things. This is a tubing system, a mapping effort by Bascom to actually figure out what's going on in their system. The green dots mean that particular line is running very well. The yellow dots mean it's kind of running or maybe an issue, and the red means it's not running at all. This to me looks like an early morning when the lines are still frozen. But if you're running SAP during the day and everything's running well, and you have a line that's red, then it can tell you that there's an issue there, and you can go pinpoint that issue in that line. That works out pretty well for a producer like Bascom's, because they may have 80, 90,000 taps out there, and miles and miles of line to walk. And so if there's an issue, you have to walk up the line and see if there's anything wrong, and then you walk up the other line and keep on going. But with this mapping system, you can actually see where the problems are and go there pretty quickly. So some efficiencies that kick in when you get really big, like Bascom's here. Pretty neat setup, I think, but it's pretty amazing to see the technology that they have. These little radio transponders tied to trees out in the woods that come back to the sugar house where they can follow it. And again, those maple sugar bushes, the maple orchards, this is the modern day kind of setup. There's no buckets out there. There are all these lines that come down to a central part, and most of them, well, not most of them, but a good portion of them are under vacuum, meaning the atmospheric pressure inside those lines is lower than the atmospheric pressure just outside in the air, and it's that difference that allows for sap to flow out at a greater volume. At the bottom of those sap lines that are under vacuum, you'll see what we call a releaser, and this is the sap flowing in here. So the sugar bush is up here to the right, and the sap flows in. And when this fills up, it actually you see there's the part of that mechanism we're looking at up here, and then this will fill up, and then once it reaches a certain level, this will open up and release sap out here. And this releaser essentially maintains the vacuum that's happening in the whole system, so you don't lose it when it opens up. So that's usually the setup that you see in these vacuum systems. It's pretty impressive. So a lot of technology that comes with that setup, but without this releaser, you wouldn't be able to do it. So I often get questions about when is sugaring season. It really depends. This year it really started kind of beginning of March, but around McKean area, it's mid-February, go into mid-April. 5 to 10, 8 weeks or so is pretty typical, but it really has to do everything with the weather. You need that sustained weather of thawing during the day, 40s, and then lows of 20s, freezing at night. And that combination allows for pressure to be built up in the tree. And it's that pressure that allows for the sap to flow out of the tree when you tap it. And then sap collection, just to give you a sense, I think most people are familiar with what you need, but you need about 40 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of syrup. So when we talk about tap counts, you can usually divide that tap count by 4, and that will dictate how many gallons of syrup you have. So if you have 40,000 taps out there, you're going to have 10,000 gallons worth of syrup. So that's a pretty large number. And the same thing goes with 400 taps for a normal or small producer. It'll give you about 100 gallons of syrup. And that's plus or minus there. I always like that visual just to show how much work it takes. So you have this one jug here equals 40 jugs of sap. So it's just kind of a why would anyone make syrup? It's so much work, right? And then just looking at containers here, I see syrup packaged in so many different ways, and it's so neat to see what it is. And nice glass bottle goes a long way. Historically, though, we put it in these metal containers. This is a container from 1955 that was sealed in 55 and put up into the loft and forgotten. And if you shake it, you can still hear stuff inside of it. It's still there's still something in there. I don't want to get into what that is, but it's probably pretty nasty. But historically, like I mentioned earlier, the maple syrup wasn't maple syrup; it was maple sugar. So it was boiled down until most of the moisture was out and stored as cubes like this. And so you can see these old photos here where these are actually forms. We're looking kind of down on them. That when the maple sugar was molten, they would pour them into these forms, and then they just pop them out, and you'd have that in the pantry to shave off and do whatever. Forms came in all shapes and sizes, including coffins for what I'm guessing is funeral sugar, and also maybe heart shapes, which may be for weddings, or probably weddings, or Valentine's Day perhaps. But they had all these different forms, you name it. And what I find pretty cool is which I've never seen one in real life, are they sugar devils, as they call them, because they have horns, but these would be like augers that you drill down into the barrels of maple sugar just to create shavings and things like that. Pretty neat setup, but again, that's why we call it maple sugaring. Again, that pot or that cauldron or big cast iron pot over an open fire, and just boiling and boiling and boiling away over time. You can imagine the sugar was pretty smoky at that point, maybe some ash in there, things like that, you name it. This fella doesn't look too clean anyway, so you can imagine that there's going to be some funky things in that sugar. But of course, if you're a subsistence farmer, or just not a wealthy farmer at all, that sugar that you can make yourself was worth quite a bit, because it tasted great and it could go a long way. Historically, Europeans didn't bring sugaring to North America. They learned it from Native Americans, and Native Americans would use a setup quite, as demonstrated here, a dugout log, and then you can see a tap that's here with a hollow pith that they would insert into the tree, and then they would actually fill that up with sap and they actually put hot rocks into that sap and to get it boiling, and then rotate those rocks in and out of the sap, and over time it would concentrate into something that was sugar. And you can imagine that, if sugar is prized, sugar, salt, fats, and those are all things that we as humans love. And once finding out how to do that, you can see why they would want to continue that process. And of course, Native Americans, folks living off the land, are pretty great observers of nature. And I'm sure, you've seen these, what they call sapsicles. If the utility company comes through in the wintertime and trims your maple tree along the road, once the sap starts to run, it'll come out and freeze, and you can actually break this off, and there's some sweetness to it. It's not like maple syrup. You can taste the sweetness. And then, watching animals. This squirrel, will come onto a red maple, bite the bark, and actually and start just to sit there and lap the sugar. Woodpeckers will do the same. Woodpeckers are known to eat sap, but they're also known to eat the insects that are attracted to the sap as well later in the season. The neat thing too is that hummingbirds will, when they first show up in New England, they will actually follow sapsuckers and woodpeckers around, because the sapsuckers and woodpeckers will break the bark, the sap will come out, and that's what the hummingbirds feed on, actually, when there's no flowers on the landscape.
Is that where the sapsucker gets its name?
Absolutely, yep. And sapsucker, again, will eat some sap, but most of the time they're eating the insects that feed on that sap. I do have a cool video. While I was waiting for a landowner for a visit, I did witness a sapsucker come in, do some pecking, feed on some insects, and then a hummingbird come right behind them. It's pretty neat. I've told that story so many times, but it was pretty neat to observe it in nature. And then these bumblebees too. I remember pulling taps one year, and then this leaky tap. You can see there's a little bit of sap kind of leaking out there, but even the bees will come and find that too. So I feel pretty good as a sugar maker that I'm kind of helping out pollinators too. It makes me feel pretty happy. I just like to point out too. So we have this history of European settlers, Native Americans, our wildlife, feeding on sap. But sap extraction and use is nothing new. It's not a new world thing. In Europe and in Asia, they're also doing this. In Scandinavia, they'll actually ferment sap as a digestive, not maple sap, but other tree saps as a digestive. Russia and Alaskan natives would actually make birch syrup. I think the Koreans have it right. They just drink sap during the maple season. They don't even process it. It's just they skip the step of making syrup. But they have a long history of harvesting sap from maples, their native maple trees on the Korean Peninsula, and just drink it as a rite of spring.
Sap and sake.
Yeah, that's not a bad idea, huh? Yeah, maybe some bourbon. Yeah. So evaporators, I mentioned that cauldron that was once used, but these evaporators really changed the game with these long flat pans here. You can boil more sap the more surface area you have, so that's why we have these massive pans that you have that's seen here with a big fire roaring, big chimney that would carry that heat away. You can see the legacy of those today. This is modern day times in Windsor, New Hampshire. Sugar house that was abandoned in 1955, but again, you can see that long flat pan laid on its side. This is about 14 feet long, 5 feet wide, with two big handles on each side, so you can pick it up and move it. And what we call the arch, or the firebox, just a big fireplace that would you stoke that constantly, and then you have a chimney behind it. This one is obviously not in operational use. That's the sugar house in which that arch belongs to. Historically, it's the Perkins family sugar house. Ran from 1907 to 1955. The interesting thing, in 1955, they buttoned up the whole sugar house like they're going to come back in 56 and never did. So it's just like it's a time capsule in there. It's pretty neat. Alan Eden, no, I'm sorry, not Alan. Alan Rumrell, the Cheshire County Historical Society, recently had an article on the Grant State Evaporator Company. It's a nice little read. You can search on the Keene Sentinel. Alan's a tremendous resource for historical events and just history in general for Cheshire County. So I encourage you to check that out. But he talked about the Grant State Evaporator Company, a little foundry in Marlow, New Hampshire. If you know Marlow, a little tiny town. But this fellow bought a foundry in 1970, started making evaporators, and did it till it burned down in the early 1900s. But essentially, anytime there was a foundry, there's an excuse me, there's an option to make a maple evaporator. So these are the doors that we're seeing here of the evaporator that would open up. But so Concord, New Hampshire, plenty coming out of Lebanon, New Hampshire, that had a strong foundry background. So it's kind of neat to see. There's all these kind of local foundries producing their own version of a maple evaporator. Today, there's probably half dozen producers that make evaporators within the maple region. So there's been a real big consolidation of that material. A nice little finishing evaporator here. So this is not where they're boiling all the sap, but this is where they're actually pulling off the finished product. So they call that a finishing pan. Today, most people use propane. But here, folks are making maple taffy. And I love the trays that they got from a local bar, the Pabst Blue Ribbon trays here that you have here. But today, you actually see in that old sugar house that was abandoned, this is the finishing pan. So they had that big arch, that 14 feet long by 5 feet wide, and then they'd finish the syrup on this little tiny evaporator here. These old barrels that you see kicking around, pretty neat. Evaporators, they've come leaps and bounds over the years. The addition of flues and separations here increases efficiency. And so does the fan, not the fan, the oil jet that they're actually boiling on too. It's pretty neat to see. But there's really like sugar houses back, especially 50 years ago, evaporators ran the gamut, and there's so many different iterations of them. It's pretty neat to see. Neat one with some steam control on top here. This is what you're really going to see if you go into any sugar house today. Just kind of a normal 3x8, 3 feet wide by 8 feet long evaporator. Pretty standard, wood fired. Sugar houses we talked about again. I love the diversity from everything from a little, not sure if it's going to fall over next week, or pretty quintessential. Usually there's plenty of additional add-ons to them. People expand and contract their production. They're just always kind of hidden in the woods, usually at the bottom of a slope someplace. Nice one here. This one runs on wood pellets. Kind of neat to see that, and that's a wood pellet silo that you have there. Again, you can see the addition. So there's the silo, and that addition of two-tone in that wood. So on the left side, that's the older part, and then they decided to add a bigger evaporator, and so they had to make room for it. Pretty common to see there. And inside, that's that wood pellet one. You can see the kind of the bunghole there that you can kind of peek into and see the wood pellets burning. I put this back up just because if it wasn't for the folks kind of maintaining that maple industry from the say the 30s into the 80s, we probably wouldn't have such a strong one that we have here today. Those ones were really kind of the holdouts that kept that going, adopted new technology now and again, and worked out some of the bugs so that when there was a mass adoption in the 80s and now in the present day, they were able to kind of learn from mistakes and just kind of move ahead with the business. So I think I kind of hold those folks who continued to make syrup during that time frame in pretty high regard, just because they really just kept the light on for the maple industry. So it's pretty neat to see. The modern day sugar house, there's a lot of shiny things that cost a lot of money at this point. So these evaporators can be pretty pricey, but again, very efficient, and quite often will pay for themselves very quickly. And most modern sugar houses have this funny little room now in the back here. You can see, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but in the back is a machine called a reverse osmosis machine. And that machine, it's technology from the 50s actually, that they would use in desalination plants, where they take seawater and produce pure water. In the early 80s, someone had the idea to take those machines and actually do the opposite, where you'd actually take maple sap, take the water out of it, and take the concentrated sap, which can be anywhere from 8% sugar content all the way up to 40+% sugar content, and they would just get rid of that pure water and boil that sap down. So traditionally, let me go back to the.
Steve, is that Stewart and John's evaporator?
No, and I'm trying to remember whose evaporator that is. It's not Stewart and John. No, it's not Don. No.
Okay.
Yeah. Stewart and John's has a wall here, a wall of barrels behind it. But this is Bascom's reverse osmosis machine room, essentially, where they process their sap just to make it more concentrated. If you take 2% sap that has 2% sugar content and bump it up to 8%, you've removed 75% of the water in that sap. And by removing 75% of the water, you can make syrup 4 times faster. You use 75% less fuel, less wood, less time. So it's a huge savings that you see there. And really just that schematic for it, if you want to get into it, is that you have your sap that goes through, it's pressurized, and under pressure, water can go through a membrane, go through a filter, because the water molecules are smaller than sugar molecules. And the water gets pushed out, and then the sap just falls out in a concentrated form. If you were to cut open that filter, it just looks like a giant roll of paper towels with super, super tiny pores that allow only for water molecules to fall through.
Does it affect the taste of the syrup, of the finished product?
Yeah, good question, Rufus. So Proctor Maple Research Center, a facility of the University of Vermont, and probably the leader in maple research in at least the United States, if not North America, they do a number of different studies and tests. And that was one question that came up, is with mass adoption of reverse osmosis machines in the industry, is there a difference? Sugar makers who don't use ROs will swear that you can taste the difference. UVM did a pretty neat study where they did a blind tasting with both sugar makers who know what things should taste like and the general public. And under a blind tasting, there was no difference they couldn't tell what was RO filtered, and they couldn't essentially identify any difference with that. So, so that's kind of what I point to. I think there is a difference as well, but I don't know. Maybe it's just, it's mental, Good question though. Technology again, so reverse osmosis and vacuum systems have been two of the biggest advances in the maple industry. Day like today, I know it's like 55 degrees and it hasn't frozen at night in a while. My sap is just barely trickling out. It's just not that much. And I'm sure if my lines were on vacuum, I'd be able to harvest some sap. And so it's that addition of vacuum systems in maple allows you to harvest more sap throughout the season on days that aren't good for sap running, but also when the days are really good, you can actually harvest a lot more. So so that adoption has been pretty amazing. I'm not sure if you saw this article where they a few years back now, 2013 now, it's scary. UVM, these are researchers from UVM at the Proctor Maple Research Center. UVM has a phenomenal plant physiology department. With plant physiology comes a study of how sap moves through trees. So they took a bunch of saplings or that you see in front of the researchers here, and they cut them off and put a vacuum cap right on to see if they could extract maple sap. And it turns out you can. And you can do it if you had a plantation of trees like this, you can actually have a 10-time increase in production. So instead of producing 40 gallons of sap per acre, you can do 400 gallons of sap per acre. The labor is extremely intensive because you have to cut the tree and put a cap like this on it every year. And so, it takes forever to do, but it was really just a proof of concept type of thing. So if we had to plant maples sometime in the future in plantations, it could be done. So there is a future with sugaring, even with the threat of invasive insects or invasive or just climate changing over time. Maples can definitely make a go at it in this setup. It's pretty horrifying to think about a plantation though, where you have 5,000 stems per acre. all lined up with these and being cut off and the sap sucked out of them like that. But that's really a transition into an agricultural process. That's how we grow our tomatoes in a row, right? We have this plantation of tomatoes, we have plantations of corn. This would be the same thing for this agricultural product. Not saying it's great, I'm just saying that's the thing. I like to have this conversation too. This was a while ago too, so this may be old news, but Canada, Quebec makes about 85% of the world's syrup. And so they are by far the leaders in syrup, and they essentially have a strategic reserve of syrup, just like we have. The United States has strategic reserve of oil and helium. They have it for maple syrup because it's such a huge part of their economy. And in 2012, $18 million worth of syrup was stolen at the time, and it was snuck out of this giant warehouse over years, where the people on the inside would switch water for maple syrup, and they actually rented a facility next door and stored it there, and they put out the syrup out in the black market. Most of those people are in jail now because of it. We got some pretty strict jail sentences, but just to show you though that strategic reserve of syrup, this is all 55-gallon drums of maple syrup here. It's just millions of gallons of syrup. It's pretty neat. And they have these what's that, Tracy?
Did that happen to be in a movie? That
It should be it should be a movie, right? It's a pretty neat story if you go back to it. The fellow who's the ringleader to this day still hasn't told officials where the money is at this point. So it's pretty neat. Some of that syrup ended up across Canada, but also some of it came down to New England too. So it was just spread throughout the Maple region. It's pretty neat. So this is kind of the big industrial side of sugaring. When we think of Bascom's, they're kind of in this system of producing barrels and barrels of syrup. I know a producer up north that I have some research plots on his sugar bush. He's filling up one of these barrels every 22 minutes from his evaporator. It's such a huge operation. But the cool thing though is that there's people like this, Mr. Shu in Amherst, New Hampshire, who sends me updates on how he's doing in his backyard. And he has this nice little, if you want to call it a sugar house or a sugar balloon, whatever you want to do. But he just does. That's how he does it. For a lot of us, that's how sugar makers start out. Kind of a backyard setting with the kids, and then you slowly expand and expand. So I think it's pretty cool that we have that diversity of sugar makers here in New Hampshire, both the industrial and also the small backyard folks. But it's come a long way, sugaring over the past 200-300 years. But at the end of the day, it's the same process. You're boiling water, and some of us boil that water better than others. But to me, I think it's pretty neat to see. So with that, I'll leave my buddy here, little squirrel Fred. But happy to answer questions. I think we get plenty of time. But yeah, go from there.
Steve, I'm curious about how they determine the sugar content or the sugar value. When I made bottled soda, we started with water and cane sugar, and we had to measure the Beaumet using a specific gravity tester.
Yeah.
Do they use that in the syrup industry?
Yes. Yeah. Use a hydrometer.
Right.
You can use Beaumet. We use bricks, but both are measurements of density.
Yeah.
The more sugar there is in something, the denser it is, right? And so the more it floats with that. But we use that for measuring sap, sugar content, but also for the final product too. And so when folks are boiling, they're paying attention to temperature, because temperature is also a function of density. The more dense something is, the higher the boiling temperature. But once you get close to that boiling temperature of syrup, that's when you start using the hydrometer just to dial in where you need to be. Yep.
Very good.
Yeah.
And the different colors that, amber, dark amber, a super special dark, is that again a gradation scale?
There's four grades based on color. Well, color and taste. The color and taste have to be the same. So there isn't really a spectrum, but syrup does. It falls within a spectrum, and it's done by a grading kit. And so you're measuring your syrup against a standard piece in the grading kit, And it's all, most of the time it's ocular. There are some machines that can do it based on light transmissivity, and things like that. But yeah, that grade is a reflection of the color and the taste. It's the same amount of sugar content. There's not more sugar in a darker one versus
Right.
light. It's all about the types of sugar that's in there and how it was boiled and handled over time. So traditionally, that very light syrup is early in the season when there's a lot of sucrose in there, very complex sugar that doesn't brown and break down easily. And as the season goes along, you get darker and darker. Traditionally, there can be different things that happen during the season that affect grade, but that's the case. Yep. Yeah. Cool.
And
Yeah.
as the industry really became industrialized, I'm assuming they had to really move from the backyard dust and whatever was in it to food grade standards, which
Yeah.
is why you see a lot of stainless steel, and I saw the filters there.
Yep.
Do they do filtering from the tap, or since it's a closed pressurized system, is there a need to do any filtering?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the my yeah, it's like the dirty secret of sugaring is like, lines get pretty funky because they stay out all year. And so, I'm always, the first runs we're filtering that out. We try to have a good filter on when you're moving sap, the filter, and that takes care of those things. And then when it comes off of evaporator, it's usually being filtered. There's filter presses on a larger scale that uses diatomaceous earth that grabs onto a lot of things. And yeah, so the very large people are using those massive filter presses to get that out. But even just a normal either wool filter or a synthetic Orlon filter or something like that will take care of the vast majority of the things that you don't want in your syrup.
They must flush those lines too, don't they?
Some do, yeah, some do, some don't. There's different, there's really no standard practice on that. But a lot of people will put turbulent water and turbulent air up into the system to blow it out. And that flushes out a lot of the sap that's still in there. That if it's not out of there, then it will just kind of mold and do its thing over the summertime. Yeah. So, yeah.
Funky.
Well, I mean, that's funky is a good description of it. It's but a lot of times though it ferments though too. That's the other thing, and that fermentation produces that alcohol that will just kind of sterilize it as well. So that's kind of the benefits. But we get some funny things. There's wood chips that get into the lines because you're drilling in with a drill, and then the wood is still in the tap hole sometimes, and then it gets flushed out. And so there's stuff that shows up, and moths, you name it. So Don, I had to dump 25 gallons of sap because I had a chipmunk in it. So I had to clean that barrel out and stuff, my little barrel. So
Good. I'm glad you didn't bring it to me.
I stared at it for a while now, I didn't.
Well, tell us what might happen next week, Steve.
Yeah, I think, well, here's what we're hoping, right, Don? It's that, so we talked about weather conditions. Last week was fine, ran well. We had some pretty warm days, 55, and then it dropped down to freezing, down into the 20s. And that's what you want. You want those, maybe 20 degrees at night, 25 degrees. This week is horrible for us. It's just, it's 55 right now. Maybe it'll be 40 tonight. Last night, I think it didn't get below 50.
Right.
It was almost 70, I think, the day before. Those are horrible. And that type of weather really accelerates bacteria growth, just natural bacteria growth that heals the tap holes, that works on the sap. And so you actually have the slowing of sap flow, and the quality of sap gets less when it gets really hot. So next week, I think Monday night, it's supposed to get down to low or mid 20s, mid to high 20s. And so the hope is that will kind of restart the season for us. And that can happen. You still have the tap holes slowly closing up over time, but it looks like maybe next week will be a good week before it gets hot again. And the hope is that we can kind of limp through this week, clean up a little bit. It gives me a chance to clean my tanks and stuff like that, and then get ready for next week, and hopefully we'll get a better sap run then. But that's the hope. Traditionally, I would go into kind of, April 10th to April 15th would be an end date for me in Peterborough. But at that point, though, the sap is pretty It's pretty funky. Yeah.
I'm hoping we have a good week because I'm at about 50% of
Yep.
my average production for the
Yep.
year.
Yeah, I think most people are as well. Just it's been so cold too. In the month of February, it was very cold, and we just didn't have those days that would run. I think March 1st or so was really the first time the sap ran, which is a little late for us. So we're behind, and the weather's not cooperating. But that's farming now, right?
Do the larger producers buy, do they augment their supply by buying from smaller operations?
Yeah. The great thing about people like Bascom's is that
Yeah.
you can produce some syrup that you don't want to sell yourself for a number of reasons, and you can go and sell it to them, and they'll mix it in with the large volume that they have. Bascom's has syrup silos that are about 8,000 gallons each,
Wow.
and so they'll they do all that processing of sap there, and other producers too will sometimes buy in sap to sell on their own as well. And so New Hampshire sells more syrup than it produces. So you can kind of figure out how that works.
One of the advantages of selling sap to Bascom is that he has all kinds of sugar making equipment. And if you're in need of a new evaporator or any type of product, he will give you the product rather than pay you for the sap, for the syrup. I mean.
Yeah. It's a pretty cool setup. Yeah.
Susan, you're muted.
Yeah.
I read someplace that maple syrup is actually better for you than honey because maple syrup has only sucrose, whereas honey has a lot of fructose in it. Is that true?
So that is true in terms of the sugar content or the types of sugar that's in it, but maple syrup also has fructose and glucose in it. Again, the darker the syrup, traditionally the higher or the lower the sucrose level is. So when you have a very light syrup, that light syrup translates into a higher sucrose content traditionally. Not always, but usually that's the case. And that's because there's a process when you're boiling, when sugar has heat applied to it, it browns. So just like when you make toast, it's called the Maillard effect. It's a chemical reaction. And that chemical reaction is more apt to happen on simple sugars like glucose and fructose. And sucrose is very resistant to that reaction because it needs to break down into glucose and fructose first, and then go through that chemical reaction. So not sure if that's how deep of an answer you wanted to get into, but yeah. But when sap is early in the season, when it's very cold and still flowing, traditionally it's a higher sucrose content, but does still contain some of those other two. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I just say
I
maple's better than
feel-
honey, just because maple is better than honey. Yeah.
Well, yeah, of course.
Of course it is, right? Yeah. Yeah. So.
Yeah, and we can hear about different bee sources or pollen sources gives a different flavor to the honey.
Yeah.
But I'm assuming that for the maple industry, they pretty much want to have it be a similar taste gradient rather than have variations, great variations.
Yeah, there are flavors that are associated with the colors, with the grades itself.
Yeah.
And you want it to fall within that. So a very light syrup that's made very well should not have any or very little maple flavor at all. It has a vanilla flavor, has a buttery flavor with a hint of vanilla. And then the darker you go, the more maple it gets. The darkest one they call it robust. And so that's you think about coffee that's robust, it's very very strong. That's what you want. A golden delicate is just that. It's golden in color, delicate in taste. And so you want that. You don't want any off flavors, which can happen too. Just these weird things that happen metabolically with the tree, or the sugar maker does something wrong. Then you don't want that. But syrup, I mean, I judge syrup almost every year, and the variation, even within a grade, is amazing. It can be very flat, it can be very complex.
Okay.
It's pretty amazing. It's like a, well, it's like, you know, it's like a wine. It's like anything else, you know, it's like a Malbec isn't a Malbec isn't a Malbec, just like a, you know, an amber isn't an amber. You know, so, Yeah.
Right. Sure. And just as the pollen can change over time for the bees, the trees will go through times of stress and greater growth capability, and that probably will affect the sap over time.
I don't, yeah, you know, I don't,
No?
well, healthy trees can produce more sap and can have better sugar content, you know. So if you have stressed trees, you may actually have less sap being produced.
Okay.
There is a concept that people, again, UVM put out as a terroir, you know, just like with wine, with grapes grown in different regions, the soil affects the flavor. They say that with different regions of the maple world. So New Hampshire versus Pennsylvania, there's the difference in that because there's different minerals in the soils and stuff. I don't, you know, I don't think I can taste that, but you know, because I'm not sure that's the case. But like, if you're getting that specific in your syrup, then that's pretty. Just, you know, you take yourself a little too seriously, I think. So that's my. But maybe, yeah. That's,
Steve, tell us what your favorite addition to maple syrup might be for if you want to imbibe.
yeah, you know, well, there's a couple of things that I think go extremely well with syrup. One is if you can find, it's been a while since I've seen it, but there's bourbon ice cream. So bourbon flavored ice cream with maple on top of that is like primo. But if you want to skip the ice cream and just put bourbon in it, that's even better as well. A good bourbon with that's primo. A good smoked salmon too, glazed with maple. You know, that's how I treat that. But yeah, I think excuse me. There's a lot of options to get in there, but I think a good bourbon works pretty well. I have a small bottle of Old Forester, not because it's good bourbon, but just because it's a Forester name, and I'm a Forester as well. And that mixes well. So,
Sensing
well,
a
that
idea
just
for a follow-up event to this one.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Ann and Jim will be over.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Well, that challenges the concept. How do you like your bourbon? Neat? Oh, neat with a touch of syrup.
Yeah. It makes a difference. Takes the edge off, you know.
We had guests in our sugar house last night for dinner, and we started the evening off with a little Myers rum with warm maple syrup, which is devastating. At least.
Yeah, it's a hard life, huh, Don?
Yes.
You know, my wife is also she's French Canadian descent too, and her grandfather immigrated here to the United States, and after dinner every night he'd have just a plain piece of bread, white bread, and he'd dip it into maple syrup. That was his dessert every night. It's just, I don't know. So that was a very traditional way of doing it. But I think we're gonna try this weekend though, is making maple dumplings. So you make a dough and you boil that dough in maple water mixture. And so if you just Google maple dumplings, you can find that recipe. It's pretty simple. I mean, we're gonna try it out, I think. So, yeah.
I was pleased to.
I'm hungry. I'm hungry now.
There you go. No, it's lunchtime. Yeah.
I was pleased to see the picture you had of snow and syrup, because my late mother used to do that all the time when I was growing up in the 60s. And it was always real syrup because she got it from either northern Vermont or northern New Hampshire.
Yep.
And, you know, one of those snows, she'd go out with a big basting pan, scoop it out, heat up the syrup, and just drizzle it on, and we'd have fun.
Yeah, it's such a great for kids. You know, you can kind of pick it up and twirl it and do your thing. Yeah, it's fun. Yeah.
It's always the highlight of the open house weekend, the sugar on snow.
Yeah. I know some folks in southern New Hampshire have a snow cone machine that just make plain ice shavings because there's no snow out today. You know. So,
yeah,
that's a great memory. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Steve.
Yes, thank you for coming on. Yeah, excellent. Yeah, appreciate it.
We appreciate it very much, Steve. This was very informative. I learned a lot. And
excellent. Yeah.
Seeing those old pictures is just priceless. I love
I just like showing those old ones. Yeah.
That was really great. So
Yeah, the slides were wonderful. I enjoyed it very much.
Very interesting. interesting presentation.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for coming, spending an hour. Yeah.
So how often do you serve something with maple syrup in it at Hillside?
Ah,
Oh.
That's a very good question. I would guess we'd have to ask the residents. I'm sure it's just as frequent as you hope it is.
So as frequent as you make it.
it could be a little more.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, we do have the salmon with the maple. It's got a chili pepper in it too, though.
Ooh,
Salmon and chili glaze.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that worked.
Mhm.
Mhm.
I like that. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, if Aaron could get somebody to make some maple sugar cookies or maple flavored cookies,
Yep.
that might be a
Yep.
nice touch.
He could do some fritters, just some basic corn
Oh,
fritters
oh,
with.
yeah.
And we haven't had those for a while.
There you go. Aaron is going to be so mad with marketing that we just put all these ideas out there.
Yeah.
And I have not bought any of the commercial non-product for forever. So
Yep.
we always have a tub, one of the jugs in the fridge after it's been opened.
Yep, perfect. Yep,
Yeah.
yeah. Well,
Thank
we
you,
don't want to
Steve.
keep, Steve's probably got more things to do today. We don't want to keep him too
Right.
long past here. So anyway, thank you everybody for coming and appreciate your time and your interest. And thanks again, Steve. It was a great presentation.
Great,
Appreciate
thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you
Danielle.
very
Thank
much.
you, Steve.
it.
Take care.
Good.
Take
Take
care,
care, everyone.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
All right. Well, thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Steve. We
No, it's fine.
appreciate it.
Yeah. All right. Take care.
And there were two.